Turn on the camera. Now. The text flashed across my phone in the middle of dinner with my only son, Matthew. For a heartbeat, the clink of silverware and the warm glow of the restaurant faded into nothing. I slipped the phone under the breadbasket, forcing my hands to stay steady, while my mind screamed questions I wasn't ready to answer. 3 years ago, after losing my husband, I thought dinners like this would bring us closer. Tonight, his smile felt colder than the air outside. And as the door swung open, revealing the very people I'd hoped I'd never need, I understood. Sometimes the person you love most can be the one to break you completely. It was one of those warm June evenings when the air felt heavy with the scent of grilled food from the sidewalk cafes. I sat across from my son, Matthew Collins, at a small Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of Charleston, South Carolina. At 66, I'd been retired from teaching elementary school for almost a decade, and yet there were still moments when I caught myself looking at him as though he were a boy in my classroom, searching his face for signs of trouble he wouldn't speak about. He was 35 now, a self-employed real estate agent, and the only child I had left after my husband David passed away 3 years earlier. We didn't see each other often, not since the funeral. And dinners like this always seemed to balance on a knife's edge, part warmth, part strain. The table was set neatly with white linens and flickering candles, a faint hum of conversation from other diners filling the space between us. Matthew had ordered a bottle of red wine before I even arrived, and now he poured it with an easy smile, making small talk about the weather, the local baseball team, and a new development he was consulting on. I let him talk, watching the way his eyes darted away when I asked a direct question about how business was going. The waiter set down our plates. Chicken piccata for me, ribeye for him. And I was just reaching for my fork when my phone buzzed on the table. The glow of the screen caught the corner of my eye. A message from an unsaved number filled the display. Short, urgent, and unmistakably from Michael Turner. My oldest friend had never been one for small talk, and lately his warnings had been circling one name, Matthew. I glanced up, meeting my son's eyes. That easy smile was still there, but it didn't reach all the way. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked, voice even. I let out a small breath, keeping my tone light. Just someone checking in. Sliding the phone under the table, I tapped the camera app open with my thumb and set it to record, resting it discreetly beside my water glass. The room suddenly felt warmer. My ears were filled with the sound of silverware and low voices from surrounding tables, but my focus narrowed on every detail in front of me. The way Matthew's shoulders tensed when he leaned back, the way he avoided eye contact whenever he spoke about his work. He reached for his wine and glanced toward the door as if expecting someone. I tried to keep my own movements steady, my voice light. "You seem distracted tonight," I said, cutting into my chicken. He shrugged, chewing slowly. "Just a lot going on. Deals to close, meetings to line up. You know how it is." I nodded, but didn't press. Inside I could feel the unease coiling tighter. Michael wouldn't have sent that message without a reason, and he wouldn't have chosen tonight unless he knew something was about to happen. Matthew asked me about my garden, and I answered, describing the hydrangeas blooming along the fence. He laughed politely, but it didn't touch his eyes. Every few minutes his gaze flicked toward my handbag resting on the chair beside me. I noticed it. I also noticed the way his hand hovered near his own jacket pocket, as if checking for something. The minutes dragged. I forced myself to take small bites, to nod along, to smile when appropriate. But behind that mask, my mind was a storm. Why tonight? What did Michael know? And most importantly, what was Matthew planning? I lifted my glass, taking a slow sip of wine, my eyes never leaving my son. A waitress I'd known for years passed by our table, balancing a tray of pasta dishes. She caught my eye and gave me a warm, familiar smile. "Good to see you, Mrs. Collins," she said softly as she moved along. I smiled back without thinking. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught the faint tightening of Matthew's jaw. His fork paused for just a second before he forced a laugh about something I hadn't said. My phone buzzed again in my lap. I kept my face neutral as I slid it open under the table. A new message appeared. He'll give himself away. Keep recording. The number wasn't saved, but I didn't need it to be. Michael's words were as clear as if he were sitting beside me. I set the phone back against the breadbasket camera, still rolling. The knot in my stomach pulled tighter. Michael wouldn't be this certain unless he knew something imminent was about to happen. The last time he'd sent me a message like that, it had been the night before my neighbor's son was arrested for fraud. He never played with warnings. Trying to keep my tone light, I asked, "How's that new development you were talking about last time? The one near Ashley River?" Matthew reached for his wine, swirling it slowly. "It's fine. Still moving pieces around. A lot of legal stuff, you know how it is." I tilted my head. "Legal stuff?" He waved his hand as if brushing away a fly. "Boring details. You'd hate it." That was his third deflection in less than 20 minutes. I leaned back, letting him think I was satisfied, but I was cataloging every shift in his eyes, every twitch in his hands. The conversation drifted to the weather again, the same safe topics he always fell back on when he didn't want to talk about real problems. Another memory flashed. Just a few weeks ago, I'd opened my mailbox to find an envelope from a bank I'd never dealt with. Inside was a statement for an account in my name, but the account number was unfamiliar. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. Then another envelope arrived from yet another bank. And then the check. $8,500 made out to cash my name signed at the bottom in a shaky imitation of my handwriting. I'd held that check under the light, my heart thudding. Whoever had signed it had studied my signature carefully, but hadn't mastered the pressure of the pen the way I looped my L. I'd kept that to myself. Until tonight, only Michael knew. Matthew cut into his steak again, his knife scraping against the plate. "You're quiet tonight," he said. I forced a small laugh, just enjoying the food. But my mind was running through the pattern unexplained mail, the forged check, Michael's sudden involvement. I glanced at my purse again. I hadn't brought anything valuable tonight, at least nothing I thought Matthew might want, but his attention seemed to land there every so often. When the waitress returned to refill our water glasses, Matthew leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms casually. His eyes followed her as she moved away, then flicked toward the entrance. "This place is filling up," he murmured. I nodded, taking another slow sip from my glass. "Popular spot on a Friday?" He tapped his fingers against the table, a restless rhythm. "Do you remember that guy I introduced you to at Christmas? The one in commercial loans?" "Yes," I said cautiously. "He's been giving me some advice. About consolidating some things. Streamlining." My pulse picked up. "Streamlining what?" He hesitated a beat too long. "Assets. It's nothing you need to worry about." I smiled faintly, but inside the alarm bells were deafening. Assets. My assets. David's life insurance had been carefully tucked into certificates of deposit and bonds, and the house was paid off years ago. The thought of Matthew discussing consolidation with a loan officer without my knowledge made my skin prickle. The conversation lulled, and I let the silence hang, hoping he might fill it. Instead, he reached for the wine again, his thumb rubbing against the stem of the glass. "You still keeping up with Michael?" he asked suddenly. The question jolted me. "Why?" "Just curious. You two talk a lot." I met his gaze. We've known each other a long time. Something flickered across his face, something that wasn't quite suspicion but wasn't innocent either. He dropped his eyes to his plate and didn't bring up Michael again. The restaurant noise swelled. Clinking cutlery bursts of laughter from a nearby table. But between us, the air was thick. My phone remained hidden by the breadbasket, the camera catching every word, every glance. I could almost hear Michael's voice in my head. "Be patient. Let him show you who he is." I cut another bite of chicken. My hand, steady my mind, anything but. After David died in the fall of 2021, Matthew started showing up at my house more than he ever had in years. At first I thought it was grief drawing us together, a son making sure his mother wasn't drowning in loneliness. He would bring takeout, ask about the yard, sit in the living room like he belonged there. Somewhere in those first few visits, he offered to help me sort through the financial paperwork David had left behind. I remember the day I agreed. We were sitting at the kitchen table with sunlight spilling through the blinds. He'd just fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door, and I'd been feeling grateful when he said, "Let me take a look at Dad's files just to make sure nothing slips through the cracks." I didn't think twice. I went to the safe in the bedroom and brought out a manila folder stuffed with the deed to the house, bank account information, and investment statements. He spread the papers out like a mechanic, laying out his tools, nodding and making small remarks. "These bonds are good, but you could get a better return elsewhere. The house deed is clean, that's great. I'll keep these in order for you." When he tucked some of the documents into his own briefcase, I assumed it was for safekeeping. It didn't occur to me then that I'd just handed him the keys to my entire life. Looking back now, I can see the cracks were already there. I knew Matthew's last 2 real estate ventures had failed, both developments in Savannah that never broke ground. He'd borrowed heavily, and I'd overheard him once on the phone with a lender, his voice tight, promising to move some things around. But every time I tried to bring it up, he'd shrug it off, saying business had ups and downs. Then there was his spending: new suits, a leased Mercedes, trips to Florida that he swore were for work. It wasn't my place to tell him how to live, I told myself. He was an adult. But deep down, I think I didn't want to admit I was watching my own son drift into dangerous water. By early 2022, his visits became more targeted. He'd arrive with a laptop and sit at my dining table reviewing my accounts online, saying he was setting up automatic payments for utilities or helping me find better interest rates. I didn't notice how often he'd ask for my passwords, or how many times he'd suggest putting both our names on certain accounts so he could manage things faster. There were moments that should have stopped me cold. The time he came by with a stack of papers and slid them across the table for me to sign without explaining much. Just standard forms, "Mom, trust me." I signed. Another time he assured me a short-term loan against the house could free up cash for a project. And when I resisted, he laughed and said, "You worry too much." Now, sitting across from him at this restaurant, I felt every one of those memories press against my ribs. I saw how easily I'd confused attention with care, help with control. The way he smiled now reminded me of that afternoon when he first walked away with my deed. The clink of his knife against his plate pulled me back to the present. He was talking about a big opportunity again, though this time it was vague enough to be meaningless. His eyes didn't meet mine, and I noticed his phone light up beside him. He flipped it face down quickly. Between bites, I let the silence grow heavier. The noise from the other tables faded into the background. I could feel the space between us widening, not in inches, but in years. It was the same gap that had formed after David's funeral, when Matthew stopped calling just to talk and only reached out when there was paperwork to go over. I pushed a piece of chicken around my plate, studying him. He still had the same sharp jawline he'd had at 17, the same habit of tapping his finger when he was thinking too hard. But there was something else now. An edge I hadn't wanted to name until tonight. He looked up suddenly, catching me watching him. What he asked with a small smirk. I shook my head lightly. Just remembering, I said, "About what?" "About how different things used to be." For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance, before his smirk returned. "Things change, Mom. You have to adapt." I sipped my wine, letting the words settle between us like stones. Adapt. That's what I'd been doing for nearly 2 years now, bending around his moods, adjusting to his explanations, pretending not to see what I didn't want to face. Somewhere inside me, the warmth I'd carried for him all my life had begun to cool. Not gone, not yet, but receding, making room for something else. Resolve, maybe. I didn't know exactly what Michael was expecting me to catch tonight, but I had a feeling it was already in motion. The rest of the meal passed in slow motion, every sound amplified. The scrape of forks, the clink of glasses, the muted shuffle of the waitress's shoes on the tile. Matthew finished his steak set, down his fork, and leaned back, as though the evening was just beginning. I wasn't so sure. 3 weeks before that dinner, I'd walked into Charleston Mutual Bank with the forged check folded neatly inside my purse. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish, the kind of scent that always reminded me of David, who insisted our house be cleaned top to bottom every Saturday. A young receptionist led me to a glass-walled office where a woman in a navy blazer rose from behind her desk and extended her hand. "I'm Laura Bennett," she said, her smile warm but professional. At 38, she had the steady confidence of someone who'd been in finance long enough to know when something was off. I slid into the chair across from her and placed the check on her desk. "I need to know if this is legitimate," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She studied it, turning it under the light, her eyes narrowing slightly. "May I ask where you got this?" "It came in the mail, supposedly from my own account, but I've never written a check like this, and that's not my signature." Laura typed a series of commands into her computer, her brow furrowing as she scanned the screen. "Mrs. Collins, do you mind if I pull up your file, please?" The click of her keyboard filled the small space. Then she looked up, her expression no longer neutral. "There's a mortgage in your name. $620,000. Opened April of last year." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible. My house was paid off 15 years ago." She kept scrolling. "And there are several smaller loans, lines of credit. The total debt in your name is $850,000. I gripped the arms of the chair. "No, that can't be right. I've never—" "They're all tied to your social security number and signed under your name," she said gently. "But I agree. This signature doesn't match the one we have on file." It felt like the air had thinned. I could hear my pulse in my ears. When did this start?" Laura tapped her pen against the desk. "The first activity was in April 2022. The most recent was just last month. The pattern suggests someone has consistent access to your personal documents." The words sank like stones. Consistent access. There was only one person who fit that description, and the thought made my throat tighten. Laura printed out a thick stack of papers, sliding them toward me. "These are all the accounts and transactions. I'm required to advise you to contact the police immediately." I stared at the pages. Loan agreements, I'd never seen property listings tied to those funds payments, routed through accounts I didn't recognize. Every document bore my name in a hand that tried too hard to be mine. She leaned forward. "Mrs. Collins, whoever did this is committing serious fraud. This isn't going to disappear on its own." I nodded, though my hands were trembling. "Thank you," I managed. Walking out of the bank, the late afternoon sun felt too bright. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching the folder, the weight of it heavier than anything I'd carried in years. I thought about calling Michael right then, handing everything over, but my feet stayed planted. It wasn't just shock. It was the ache of betrayal pressing against the walls of my chest. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't some faceless criminal. If I followed the trail far enough, I was afraid of exactly whose face I'd see. I walked to my car, slowly sliding into the driver's seat and resting my hands on the steering wheel. The folder sat beside me, silent and accusing. I couldn't yet bring myself to take the next step. He was my son, my only child. And if I called the police, there would be no turning back. That night, I tucked the folder into the bottom drawer of my desk at home under a pile of old lesson plans. I didn't touch it again for days, but its presence was like a shadow over every conversation, every look, every moment I spent around Matthew. Even now, sitting across from him weeks later at that restaurant, I could feel the texture of those papers in my mind, the weight of proof, and the gnawing question of how far he was willing to go. 2 days after the dinner, I drove north to Tacoma with the folder buckled into the passenger seat like it was a living thing that might leap away if I didn't keep it close. The rain came in thin, steady lines against the windshield, blurring the road signs, until the letters looked like they were melting. I knew the way to Michael's house by heart. 3 turns off the highway past a row of cedar trees, then the little white house with the green shutters he'd bought after retiring from the force. He was waiting at the door before I even knocked a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "You look like you've been carrying bricks," he said, stepping aside to let me in. I have, I murmured, holding up the folder. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd once brought him pies for Thanksgiving when David and I were newlyweds. Now the smell of coffee mixed with the faint scent of gun oil that always seemed to linger in his house. I slid the folder across to him, watching his hands. Steady, deliberate, open it, and begin reading. The silence stretched as he flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening just slightly. Finally, he set them down and looked at me. This is serious, Laura. This isn't just bad behavior. This is felony-level fraud. I gripped the edge of my chair. It's my son, Michael. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I know, and that makes it harder. But you have to understand, people who get away with this once, they almost always do it again. And they don't stop until someone stops them. I swallowed hard. Maybe if I confront him, then he'll hide the evidence, close the accounts, and you'll never prove a thing. His voice was calm, but firm, the same tone he'd used when we were neighbors, and he'd warned the kids about playing too close to the street. He leaned back, lacing his fingers. I've worked cases like this before. Parents, siblings, even children. Love doesn't erase the damage. If anything, it blinds you to how bad it is until it's too late. I stared down at my coffee, the steam fogging my glasses for a moment. What are you saying? I'm saying we loop in the bureau. Quietly. I still have a contact at the Seattle field office. White-collar division. They can set up a controlled situation, catch him in the act, but it has to be airtight. The words "catch him" made my stomach twist. Michael, if this goes wrong, I lose him. Completely. You think you still have him now? He asked gently. The question hung between us like smoke. I thought of the way Matthew had smiled at dinner, the quick way he'd flipped his phone, face down the forged signature on the mortgage documents. My throat felt tight. Michael reached across the table, resting his hand over mine. Laura, this isn't about revenge. It's about protecting you. And maybe even protecting him from doing worse. You're not the only person he could hurt. I took a shaky breath. What would it look like, this plan? We let him think he's safe. You keep up appearances, act normal. Meanwhile, we document everything. Calls, texts, meetings. If he moves to access another account or asset, the bureau steps in. But we need his fingerprints on something undeniable. The idea of living in that performance, smiling at him, letting him think I was still in the dark, made my skin crawl. But the alternative was worse, doing nothing, waiting for the next letter from a bank I didn't know, the next forged check. Michael must have seen the hesitation in my eyes. You're not alone in this. I'll be here every step of the way. But you have to commit, Laura. Half measures won't work. I looked down at the folder again, at my name printed on loans. I'd never taken the neat forged loops of my signature. It was like staring at a stranger wearing my face. Finally, I nodded. All right, I'll do it. Michael gave a single firm nod, the kind I'd seen him give in the courtroom hallway years ago before walking in to testify. Good. I'll make the first call tonight. The rain had stopped by the time I left his house, but the sky was still heavy, the clouds low enough to touch. I drove home with the folder on the seat beside me, the decision settled in my chest like a stone. Solid, immovable, and irreversible. 2 days later, Michael called and asked if I could meet him at a small diner off the interstate, the kind of place where the coffee never stops flowing and the booths are worn smooth from years of elbows leaning in over secrets. He didn't tell me who else would be there, only that I needed to hear this. When I walked in, he was already seated in a corner booth with a tall, broad-shouldered man, whose thinning silver hair caught the light from the window. Michael stood to greet me. Laura, this is Henry Walsh. Henry shook my hand firmly, his eyes steady in a way that made me feel like he was used to taking the measure of people. I appreciate you coming, he said, sliding a half-empty mug of coffee aside. Michael gestured for me to sit. Henry has something to tell you, and you need to hear all of it. Henry leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. About 1.5 years ago, I sold my manufacturing business. 50 years of work, and I finally thought I could relax. My wife and I had plans. Travel time with the grandkids. Then your son came along. The word you're hit like a pebble against glass. Small but sharp. He pitched me on a real estate development just outside Charleston. Said he had land secured, investors lined up, permits ready to go. All he needed was some bridge funding to get the first phase started. Henry paused, his jaw tightening. I put in $50,000, signed the paperwork he provided, and then nothing. Phone calls stopped getting returned. The address he gave me for his office turned out to be a UPS store. My fingers curled around the edge of the table. Did you go to the police? I filed a complaint, Henry said with a humorless laugh. But without proof of intent, it's just a civil dispute. The contracts were vague. Deliberately so, I think. My attorney told me it would cost more to fight it than I'd already lost. Michael watched me closely. His face unreadable. Sound familiar? It did. Down to the way the story began with charm and ended with silence. I thought about the $850,000 in loans, the forged mortgage, the way Matthew had smiled at me over dinner, like the walls weren't already closing in. Henry sat back. I don't know what you're dealing with, but if it's anything like what he did to me, you should be careful. Men like that. They don't stop until someone forces them to. The words "men like that" made my stomach twist. This was my son we were talking about. My boy, who once scraped his knees learning to ride a bike, who stayed up late building model airplanes at the kitchen table. But the picture Henry was painting, layered over what I already knew, wasn't of a boy anymore. It was of a man who had learned to take without looking back. I glanced at Michael, who gave the faintest nod as if to say, "This is why." Henry finished his coffee and stood shaking my hand again. "I hope you can stop him before someone else gets hurt," he said, and then he was gone. The bell over the door jingling in his wake. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the space where he'd been. The diner's chatter swirled around me. Orders called to the kitchen, a baby fussing in a high chair. But I felt like I was underwater. Michael's voice cut through. "You see now, this isn't about one mistake. This is a pattern. And patterns like this don't fade on their own." I nodded slowly, the weight of Henry's story pressing down alongside my own. Anger began to burn under the grief, low and steady, like coals catching. If Matthew could do this to a man like Henry, someone with resources experience, what chance did I ever have of stopping him alone? I looked out the window at the gray parking lot, my reflection faint in the glass. "All right," I said finally. "We move forward." Michael leaned back, his expression grim but satisfied. "Good. Then we wait for the right moment." And for the first time in weeks, my hesitation was gone. The meeting with the Bureau was set for a Tuesday morning in Seattle. Michael picked me up just after sunrise, the sky streaked with pale pink and gray. We didn't talk much on the drive. I watched the pine trees blur past and tried not to imagine the moment I'd have to see Matthew across a table again, pretending nothing was wrong. The federal building was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that made you aware of your own pulse. We passed through security, signed in, and were led to a conference room with a view of Elliott Bay. Inside, a man in a navy suit stood as we entered. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Special Agent Mark Harris. I handle complex financial crimes for the Seattle field office." His handshake was firm, but not overbearing. I sat across from him, Michael beside me, the folder of documents between us. Harris gestured to it. "I understand you have materials for me." I pushed it forward. Everything I could get my hands on. Loan statements, forged checks, copies of correspondence. Some of it. I can't even look at anymore. He opened the folder, scanning the top page, then glanced at Michael. "From what you told me on the phone, this appears to involve multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, possibly identity theft. If these loans crossed state lines, it's federal jurisdiction." The words "federal jurisdiction" made my chest tighten. Harris continued, his tone even. "Here's how this works. We build a case from the ground up. Bank records, witness statements, any digital correspondence. Once we have enough probable cause, we request warrants for account freezes and property searches. But for the strongest case, we need to catch him in the act. I looked at Michael, then back at Harris. You mean, set him up? Not set up, Harris said carefully. We let him walk into a situation of his own making. We record everything. Audio, video, transaction logs. That way there's no question about intent. He flipped to a page with my forged signature. This right here, a defense attorney could argue you authorized it verbally. But if we have him presenting forged documents or soliciting fraudulent investments on tape that's airtight, I felt the same knot of nausea I'd had in Michael's kitchen. And if it fails, then he knows you're onto him and the evidence dries up, which is why timing is everything. Harris closed the folder and leaned forward. Michael mentioned you have a dinner coming up with your son. Is that right? Yes. He invited me to discuss an opportunity. I could barely say the phrase without hearing the echo of Henry's story. That's our in, Harris said. We'll wire you with an audio transmitter, possibly a concealed camera. The location will be monitored. If he makes any incriminating statements or presents you with documents, we'll have agents nearby ready to move. Michael's hand rested on the table, steady as ever. We can make sure she's comfortable with the equipment. I hesitated. And if he notices, most people don't, Harris said. But if he does, you end the meeting and leave. Simple as that. The idea of wearing a wire to dinner with my own son felt surreal, like something out of a movie I'd never choose to watch. But every time doubt crept in, I saw Henry's face, heard the quiet resignation in his voice when he said he'd never see his money again. Harris slid a card across the table. Keep this on you. Memorize the number on the back. It's a direct line to our operations desk. We'll have a cover story ready if you need to leave early. I took the card, my fingers brushing the raised seal. The meeting wrapped with a list of steps I'd review the dinner location with Michael, keep my phone fully charged, and avoid any mention of my suspicions until that night. As we stood to leave, Harris said, Mrs. Reynolds, I know this is difficult, but you're in control here. Remember that. Outside, the Seattle air smelled faintly of salt and diesel from the ferries. We walked in silence to Michael's car. Only when we were on the freeway again did he speak. You all right? I stared out at the skyline receding behind us. No, but I will be. We drove south, the hum of the tires filling the space where my thoughts should have been. The date of the dinner was already on my calendar, circled in red, and now it wasn't just a family meal. It was the beginning of the end. The chocolate mousse had just been set down between us when Matthew leaned back in his chair, swirling the last sip of his wine. His smile was casual, but his eyes held that glint I'd learned to watch for. So he began. I've been looking at an opportunity. Timing's perfect, and it's something I think you'll appreciate. I set my spoon down, folding my hands loosely in my lap. What kind of opportunity? A development project out in Bend, he said, his voice light conversational. Short-term, flip huge upside. All I need is $100,000 to get the ball rolling. It's just to create cash flow to handle some temporary debt. Bridge financing, really. I tilted my head. Bridge financing, you can't get from your own assets. His jaw tightened just slightly. I've got everything tied up right now. But you, on the other hand, me, I kept my tone even. He smiled like it was obvious. Mom, your assets are my assets eventually. Why let them just sit there? It's only a matter of time before they're mine. The words landed like ice water down my back, but I forced a calm expression. Interesting way to look at it. It's practical, he said, cutting into the mousse. I've got pressure on me right now. People waiting on me to deliver. And you can help me make that happen. Think of it as protecting the family legacy. I leaned forward slightly as if intrigued. And what exactly is this project in Bend? He launched into a vague description. Prime land, exclusive buyers, and a silent partner who would double the investment in 6 months. It was all smoke and mirrors. I could hear the gaps, the deflections. Sounds ambitious, I said softly. And risky. He gave a short laugh. Everything worth doing is risky. You taught me that. I let that hang for a moment, then asked, "And if it doesn't work?" His eyes narrowed, but he shrugged. "It will. I've got contingencies. Besides, worst case, the property itself is worth more than we'd put in." I asked, watching his expression. "You, me, family." He gestured between us with his fork, then took another bite. "It's just numbers, Mom. You've got the resources, I've got the plan. Why fight that?" I nodded slowly, my mind cataloging every word, every casual assumption that what was mine was already his. "And this pressure you mentioned. What kind of pressure?" He shifted in his seat, glancing away. "Deadlines, investors wanting answers. You know how it is. I did know. Just not in the way he meant. And you're sure this will fix it?" "Positive," he said. "Once this deal closes, everything changes." The tension between us had thickened, though his voice stayed smooth. He was trying to keep it light, but the undercurrent was there, a mix of entitlement and urgency. I picked up my spoon again, stirring the mousse without taking a bite. "You've been thinking about the future a lot lately." "No." "Of course," he said. "I'm 35. I'm not going to wait around for life to hand me things. I go after them. And you should be glad I do. It means I'm looking out for what's ours." "What's yours?" I corrected gently. His smile faltered for just a second, then returned. "You know what I mean." I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to shift uncomfortably. "Matthew," I said finally, "it's good to have a plan. But sometimes the way you go after something matters as much as getting it." He raised an eyebrow. "Is this the part where you give me a lecture?" "Not a lecture," I said, my tone soft. "Just an observation." The waitress passed by, refilling his coffee. He thanked her without looking up, then leaned in. "So, can I count on you?" I sipped my water, my face unreadable. "I'll need to think about it." His jaw worked, but he forced a smile. "Don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait." I met his gaze and held it, feeling the wire under my blouse, the quiet presence of people somewhere nearby listening to every word. Somewhere in the hum of the restaurant, the night had shifted, and we both knew it. I reached into my bag slowly, my fingers brushing past the cool leather of my wallet until they found the folder. I pulled it out and set it between us, the papers inside neatly aligned. With deliberate care, I slid a single sheet free and placed it in the middle of the table. Matthew's eyes dropped to it, his brow creasing for a fraction of a second, before he leaned back and let out a low chuckle. "You've been busy." I didn't answer. He tapped the page with one finger. "This, just a temporary arrangement. Moving pieces around, that's all." My voice was steady. "A $620,000 mortgage in my name, Matthew, signed on April 14th of last year. You want to tell me how that's a temporary arrangement?" He gave an exaggerated sigh. "It's complicated. And honestly, you're overreacting. This was for the greater good. For us." I reached back into the folder and laid down another sheet. And this one, 2 months later. A line of credit for $85,000. My signature forged again. And here, I added a third page, the cash advances, dates amounts, 14 months worth. The color drained slightly from his face, but he covered it with a smirk. "You don't get it, Mom. I was under pressure. I had no choice." "There's always a choice," I said. His tone hardened. "What I didn't have was support. You could have stepped in, helped me get through it. But instead, you've been sitting on all this." "What?" "Waiting to ambush me at dinner." "I've been waiting," I said quietly, "to hear you tell me the truth." He laughed, sharp and humorless. "Truth. Fine. I took the loans. I did it because I'm tired of scraping by while you sit on resources that could actually make a difference. You think keeping everything locked away is noble? It's selfish." "It's mine," I said. "That landed." His smile faltered and something colder took its place. His eyes flicked to my bag. "What else you got in there? Enough," I said, resting my hand on the strap. He leaned forward, voice low. "Let me see it." "No." His hand darted across the table toward the bag, but I was faster, pulling it into my lap. My grip tightened, my shoulders squaring as I met his stare. "Don't do this," he said, his voice edged with warning. "Don't take what doesn't belong to you," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. The clink of silverware from nearby tables sounded distant, muffled, as if the room had narrowed to just the two of us. He sat back abruptly, shaking his head. "You're making a big mistake. You think you've got me cornered, but you don't know half of it. I know enough," I said. "Enough to make sure this stops." His jaw tightened, and for the first time that night his confidence slipped. He reached for his coffee, but his hand wasn't steady. I leaned in slightly, my voice low and calm. "You can keep talking, Matthew, or you can start thinking about the consequences. Either way, I'm done pretending I don't see what's right in front of me." The space between us felt like a live wire humming with everything unspoken. The front door swung open with a rush of cooler night air, and 3 men stepped inside. Detective Mark Harris led the way, flanked by 2 agents in dark suits, their badges flashing under the restaurant's soft lighting. Behind them, Michael's tall frame appeared, his eyes finding mine instantly. Matthew froze, mid-sip, the cup hovering just short of his lips. His eyes darted toward the entrance, then back to me. "What the hell is this?" Harris approached our table with the measured confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "Matthew Parker," he asked, his voice carrying clearly enough to turn a few heads nearby. Matthew's chair scraped back. "Yeah." "What is this about?" Harris pulled a folded document from inside his jacket and held it out. "Federal arrest warrant. Charges include wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft." "This is ridiculous," Matthew snapped, glancing around as if searching for an escape. "She's my mother. This is just a family disagreement. You've got it all wrong." The agents stepped in closer, one on either side. Harris's voice remained calm but firm. "Sir, please place your hands on the table where we can see them." Matthew's gaze flicked to me, wild now, as though I could somehow stop what was happening. "Mom, tell them this is a mistake." I kept my eyes steady on him, my hands folded in my lap. "I told you there would be consequences," I said quietly. The agents moved quickly. One pulled his wrists forward, the metallic click of handcuffs loud in the hush that had fallen over our corner of the room. Matthew's protests grew sharper, more frantic, but no one slowed. Harris nodded to one of the agents who reached for the folder on the table. "These will be taken into evidence," he said, sliding the papers into a sealed envelope. Matthew twisted in his chair, directing his words toward Harris now. "You don't understand. I was going to pay it back. Every cent. This is all blown out of proportion." Harris met his gaze evenly. "You can explain that to the judge." Michael stepped forward, his presence like a quiet anchor in the storm. His eyes softened when they met mine, and he gave a small nod, the kind that said, "It's done." Around us, the restaurant's normal rhythm had stopped. Diners watched openly, forks, suspended conversations silenced. A waitress stood frozen near the bar, her tray balanced against her hip. As they pulled Matthew to his feet, the scrape of his chair seemed to echo louder than anything else. He kept looking back over his shoulder, his expression a strange mix of anger, disbelief, and, just for a fleeting second, fear. The agents guided him toward the door, their pace deliberate. Harris lingered just long enough to speak quietly to me. "We'll be in touch about next steps. You did the right thing." I let out a long, slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My shoulders sagged as the tension of the night began to drain from my body, leaving behind something heavier than relief. An ache I knew would take time to fade. Michael's hand brushed lightly against my arm. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of here." I nodded, glancing once more toward the door where my son had just disappeared into the night, flanked by the people who would decide his future. The room around me seemed to exhale too, voices resuming in cautious murmurs, silverware clinking again. But for me the sound felt distant, as though I were standing somewhere else entirely, watching it all from far away. The courthouse in downtown Seattle felt colder than the December air outside. The polished marble floors echoed every footstep, each sound sharp and final. I walked past the security checkpoint, clutching my purse like it was the only solid thing left in my life. Inside the courtroom, the benches were already filling with people. Reporters, victims, court staff. My eyes found him instantly. Matthew sat at the defense table in a tan prison jumpsuit, shackles at his ankles, his hair shorter than I'd ever seen it. He didn't look up when I entered. I took my seat in the second row just behind the prosecutor's table. The hum of quiet conversations died down as the judge entered. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The prosecutor, a composed woman named Karen Lee, rose to speak. Her voice was steady, deliberate. "Your Honor. The defendant, Matthew Parker, is charged with multiple counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft, totaling over $850,000 in losses." She began listing the specifics. Dates, amounts, the institutions involved. Each number landed like a blow. Then she called Henry Walsh to the stand. Henry's voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as he described how Matthew had convinced him to invest in a property that never existed, draining $50,000 of his retirement savings. I stared at the tabletop in front of me, tracing the grain of the wood, my stomach knotting tighter with every word. When it was my turn, the bailiff guided me to the witness stand. The oath felt heavy on my tongue. Karen asked about the impact Matthew's actions had on me, how it felt to discover the forged loans, the stolen funds, the betrayal. It wasn't just the money, I said, my voice catching. It was the safety of my own home, the trust I thought could never be broken. It was waking up every day, wondering how the person I raised could look me in the eye and lie so easily. Matthew didn't react. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, his jaw set. The defense attorney rose briefly, speaking about Matthew's financial pressures and misguided decisions, urging the court to consider leniency. But the plea deal had already been negotiated, guilty on all counts in exchange for a reduced sentence. Judge Reynolds read the decision with the same calm tone she'd used all morning. Matthew Parker is hereby sentenced to 60 months in federal prison with restitution in the amount of $850,000 to be paid to the victims named in the case. A faint murmur moved through the courtroom. I exhaled slowly, feeling a strange mixture of relief and grief, like two tides pulling in opposite directions. The gavel struck once. The deputies moved to escort Matthew away. He stood still, not meeting my gaze. For a moment I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Outside, the winter sun was bright, but offered no warmth. Michael waited by the steps, hands in his coat pockets. "It's over," he said quietly. I nodded, though the word didn't feel entirely true yet. The city sounds, traffic footsteps, distant sirens, felt muted, as if I were still inside that courtroom. We walked together toward the parking lot. Each step felt lighter than the last, though the weight in my chest remained. Justice had been served, but the fracture in my family was permanent. By the time I reached my car, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be about winning or losing anymore. It would be about learning how to live with the truth. Spring came early that year in Portland. The rains softened, the days stretched a little longer, and the first tulips began to push through the damp soil in my backyard. I found myself out there most mornings, hands in the dirt, breathing in the cool air, as if I could replace the heaviness inside me with the scent of fresh earth. Olivia started stopping by after her college classes, her laughter spilling through the back door before she even stepped inside. She'd roll up her sleeves without being asked, helping me clear out the shed, organize the kitchen drawers, or sit at the dining table with a cup of tea, sorting through bank statements. She never once mentioned her uncle. That silence was a kindness I hadn't expected. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Henry. His handwriting was sharp but steady. He thanked me for standing up, for making sure Matthew couldn't hurt anyone else. He said he'd gotten most of his retirement funds secured again and was considering moving closer to his daughter. I sat at the table with that letter for a long time, the edges curling under my fingers. It was proof that something good had come from all the wreckage. Michael called at least once a week sometimes, just to check in, sometimes with a story from his days on the force. There was comfort in his voice, steady, grounded, unshaken by the messiness of human behavior. He never treated me like a victim. He treated me like someone who'd done the hard thing and survived it. The nights were still the hardest. That's when the questions crept in. Could I have seen it sooner? Could I have stopped it before it went so far? But each time I'd remind myself, this wasn't about what I failed to do. It was about what I finally did. In April, I met with a financial advisor recommended by Michael. We built a plan to secure everything I had left from the house to the smallest savings account. We locked down every credit line, set up alerts for any activity in my name. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection. And it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. By summer, my backyard was alive again. Lavender lined the walkway. Roses climbed the fence. And the vegetable patch I'd neglected for years was full of tomatoes and green beans. I hosted a small gathering for the first time in what felt like forever. Just a few close friends, Olivia and Michael. We sat under the string lights plates balanced on our laps, and for a few hours the laughter was easy. I didn't talk about Matthew that night. There would be no place for him here, not now, not in the peace I was rebuilding. The truth was, the hurt would always be there, tucked into the quiet corners of my heart, but it no longer owned me. Before everyone left, Michael lingered by the gate. "You did the right thing," he said, his eyes steady on mine. "You didn't just protect yourself. You protected a lot of people." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside me. "I know," I said, "and I think I'm finally ready to live with that." As the evening air cooled and the garden lights glowed softly, I realized that this was my new life. Not the one I'd planned, but one I could shape with my own hands. If you've listened to my story, I want you to remember this. Protect yourself, even if the person hurting you is someone you love. You have the right to your safety, your dignity, and your peace. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more real stories of courage, justice, and resilience. Your support helps keep these voices heard, and you never know who it might help next.